Hi, I'm Kathy Schmitz, and I'd like to show you my favorite way to trace a pattern onto fabric when you're doing an embroidery. This is a new pattern I just finished called Blessed Sampler. And what I did is I made a copy of the pattern in reverse, and there is one in reverse in the pattern, and I printed it out on freezer paper. So freezer paper has wax on one side, paper on the other. I printed it on the paper side and ironed the wax side to my fabric. And you just use a nice dry hot iron to do that. Now the fabric and the pattern are hooked together and the fabric is stabilized. So if you try drawing on regular fabric, the fabric moves around. But once it's stabilized on freezer paper, it stays put pretty well. So you just need a light box or a window, and then you can start tracing. And I trace all of my designs using the Pilot friction pen, which disappears with the heat of an iron. So it's easy as that, and it really goes pretty quickly. And then once you've finished tracing your design, you can just peel that freezer paper off the back and start stitching. One of the things I recommend too is maybe not drawing every single line. Like these are a chain stitch, but I'm not going to draw each little chain. I'm just going to draw a line and then refer back to the pattern, and I'll know, okay, I do a chain stitch there. You can if you want, but that's a lot of tracing that you don't necessarily need to do. And I used just a single color of Baldani pearl cotton, and I stitched down this really pretty Moda linen. And now I'm going to stitch it again so that I can kind of show you some of the stitches. So this time I chose to do it on another beautiful Moda fabric that has just a little bit of a textural design to it. And this time I'm going to stitch it up with Baldani 12 weight. The green is 0519. And I think what I'm going to do at this point anyway, but I can always change my mind, is I'm going to just have just a little accent of red on the cherries and everything else be green. So I'll just go over some of the really basic stitches. The first one I'll show you is the stem stitch. So all the solid lines on the pattern are going to be a stem stitch. And you always want to start in a corner or an edge. You don't want to start in the middle of a line. And I start with about 1/8 of an inch stitch and then come halfway in between. And I'm going to carry my thread on the outside. If it's a curve, you always want to carry it on the outside of the curve. This is a straight line, so it really doesn't matter. Now the next stitch is going to be 1/8 of an inch, and we're going to come up right in that same hole. And you just continue that till you get to the corner. And then I'll show you how to turn a corner. So I'm going to take that very last stitch, it's going to be a little small one, and I'm going to take the needle down right in the corner. So now you want to bring your needle up on the other side, just like at the beginning, about 1/8 of an inch away. Now take the needle in that same corner and come up halfway in between. We're still carrying the thread on the outside. Now I've made the first stitch on the new side, and I can continue going. So as you might have noticed, this Baldani thread is variegated. So I like to make sure I have a long enough piece to do a complete side, so I don't have to stop and start in the middle of a side. But if that does happen, I will want to make sure that I start my thread, like if it's against the dark, then I want to start where the thread is darker. I don't want to start where the thread is really light and then have it be just this really strong cut off of color there. I want it to be as subtle as I can. So just something to think about when you're using a variegated thread. Now the heart is complete, so I'm going to stitch the arrow. And I'm going to make this point filled in. So I'm going to use a satin stitch, and I'm going to start at the widest point. All you need is just practice and patience. So you want to pull your needle up right next to where the thread came up and you just continue doing that without pulling it too tight. Sometimes this is very helpful to have in a hoop. If you tend to pull your thread really tight, that will help with that. And like I said, a lot of it is just patience. And if you don't like the way it looks, you take it out and try again. We'll just do one more tiny, tiny, tiny little stitch to make a point. Now we're just going to do a stem stitch to go back to form the shaft of the arrow, and it will be going over the heart. So if anybody looks very closely, they can see that, yes, indeed, the arrow is on top. So what I do is when I come to a little spot like this, I'm just going to take the needle down at the end of the stitch, up and down, just to form that little vertical stitch, and then another little up and down over here. If it's that small of a distance between, I'm not going to tie a knot or thread my thread under stitches. And now I'm going to come back and do the feathers. So those are just a single stitch from the outside to the shaft. As you can see from my original one, I didn't fill that in. I just did a little stitch around the outside of the triangle. This one I went ahead and filled in. And I tend to do that, maybe mix things up a little bit. Feel free to do that. If there's a stitch you don't like, go ahead and do a stitch that you do like. It's more important that you're enjoying the process. Okay, so now we have these dots. And these dots can be either a French knot or a colonial knot. So I'll show you how to do a French knot. You're going to wrap your thread around 3 times. You hold it gently with this finger so it's not super tight. And then put the needle down really close to where you came up. Slide those loops down to the fabric. You don't want to pull it too tight because you have to pull the needle through, but you want it pretty taut. Hold that in place with your thumb and finger, and then pull the needle through. And then you have a French knot. That's probably not my best French knot. This one's better. We're going to use a fly stitch to make bees. So I'm going to start in the middle of his body, carry my thread up so it follows his head, come down right on the other side of the body, take my needle up at the tip of his head. The thread's going to go under my needle, and now I've formed the top of his body. Now, since there's antenna there, I'm just going to go ahead and make that one of the antenna come up on the other tip of the antenna, and now I have the antenna done. And then I'm going to skip back down here to the middle of the body, and I'm going to form his rear end. So another fly stitch, so it's going to loop down, needle goes in directly across, and it comes up at his tail, and we're going to go ahead and make the stinger. So instead of bringing the thread just right down on the other side of the loop, we're going to bring it out just a little bit, and then now we have a stinger. And now the wings are, guess what? A fly stitch. Super easy. So even though this looks like a tiny bee and might be kind of difficult to stitch, it's actually super easy. All right, so we have his body and his wings finished, and now we just need the stripes. So those are just going to be a little satin stitch, and you only need a couple since there's such a small little spot there. I'll do one more on his tail. Now we're going to move up and do this stripe. So from one side of the body to the other, and then come back up on the other side. For these middle ones, I'd take 3 or 4. And you don't want to pull it too tight or you'll make them really skinny. And then we'll just do 1 or 2 up for his head, up at the top. And that bee is done. The little leaves are done using a stem stitch, but I wanted to show you what I do at the tips because I like having a really pointy little leaf. One of the things I like to do is just take a stitch that's maybe just a thread width wider or longer, and then come up right on the point. So a couple threads past the tip, come up right on the point or the tip of the leaf, and then just start the other side of the leaf, and you can see it gives it a nice little point. Inside of the heart, I put my initial K and my husband's, Steve, so K plus S. And you are more than welcome to change that if you'd like to personalize it. These are just really simply drawn. If you can do, you know, a second grade capital letter, you're set. You're all good to go. So these are going to be a back stitch. And the reason why I chose that is because a back stitch is really good if you're doing a tight curve, like an S. So I want them to be consistent, so I'm going to do them both in a back stitch. So for a back stitch, you're going to start at the end. You're working the opposite direction of a stem stitch. You're going one way, back stitch, you're going the other way. So I'm going to take about 1/8 of an inch and then another 1/8 of an inch. So you almost start off like you're doing a running stitch. But now you're going to come back to that previous stitch and go down in that same hole, get past where the thread comes out 1/8 of an inch, and you just continue on. And like I said, this is a great stitch if you're doing really tight curves. When you're stitching the letters in Blessed, it's a combination of a chain stitch and a stem stitch, mostly a stem stitch. So we're going to do a stem stitch on the outside and then a chain stitch on the inside. So you don't have to trace the little chains. You can just draw a straight line to indicate where the chain stitch will go. So for a chain stitch, you're going to start at the bottom, you carry your thread up and around, go back in that same hole at the bottom, come up, I do a little bit bigger than 1/8 for a chain stitch, and your thread's going to go under your needle. And that is the first link in your chain. If you pull it really tight, then that loop closes up, and we kind of want to see that loop because it's a cute little feature. So we just continue doing that same thing, thread under the needle, and try to take consistent length stitches, because in the stem stitch it might not show as much, in the chain stitch it is going to show. If you switch from, you know, a 1/16 of an inch to a 1/4 inch, it will really make a difference, just as long as they're consistent. The box around the word Blessed is stitched using a blanket stitch. You come up in a corner, and then I'm going to start with the first little tooth that sticks out and come back right in that same hole. So now I have my first tooth and my thread is in the corner, which is what I want. I'm going to carry my thread on the inside of the box, come down to the tip of the next tooth, go back to the line, carry the thread under the needle, and now I have a second tooth. I didn't plan that really well, and I ran out of my thread in the middle of a row. So I kind of wanted to go over that with you. To stop, you're just going to tack it in place, just kind of like a fly stitch. So your needle is going to come down right on the other side to hold that in place. Now what I have to consider is this is a variegated thread. So down here it's dark and then it gets lighter. So when I cut my next length of thread, I don't want to start with the end that is the darker thread. I want to make sure I start with the end that is lighter. One of these ends is lighter, so it will just tie in nicely. So just something to think about using when you're using variegated threads. So you're going to take that final stitch on that side, and now it's as easy as just turning your fabric and starting down the other side. and you want to bring a needle up on the inside of that little L to catch it and hold it in place. And that's how you turn a corner. A running stitch is probably the easiest stitch you can do. It's basically just like you're quilting, so you're just going up and down and up and down. And if you use a water-soluble pen or a friction pen, you could just draw a straight line, as long as it will be gone when you're done. You don't want a permanent line there after you're finished stitching. Now I wanted to show you too, I'm going to just hop up here. I normally wouldn't do that, but this heart smoke basically is a running stitch. There's a space in between each one, but because it's so tight and such small spaces in between, what I'm going to do on this is more like a back stitch, but leave a space. So I'm going to start with taking my first stitch. I'm going to come up at the other end of the next stitch. And instead, like on a back stitch, I would go back in that hole. Instead of doing that, I'm going to have just a small space in between. Now I can hop up to the end of the next stitch, go back, but leave a little space. You can do it just the same as a running stitch if you want to. It does leave just a tiny little space as opposed to a big space. When you stitch these little windows, each little pane is just going to be a single stitch. So it's kind of like a back stitch, but you're only taking two. So there's one pane, the other. Now I'll go down the center. You can, oh, that's not very straight. But as you can tell, I'm not stopping and taking it out either, because that just adds personality. Okay, I'm going to try that window again and see if I can get it straight this time. There, that window looks much better. And the little dividers between the blocks are a feather stitch with a French knot. So we're going to start with the feather stitch. You're going to start at the top, and we're going to carry our thread so it just mimics that curve, and come up at the top of the other side of the stitch, come down where it meets the next stitch. We're going to carry the thread under the needle, and there's one of them. Now you can just continue down. So we're going to do the same thing. Take the needle down on the end of the next stitch, come up at the junction, and you always carry your thread underneath, and it's really a pretty quick stitch, pretty easy. And then I'll go back and do the French knots. So that's a feather stitch. The outside border on this one is a simple cross stitch and a French knot, which symbolizes a hug and a kiss. So you want to start on the outside of the X, cross over, so you're doing one side of the X and go straight down, and now you're doing the other side of the X. Now I'm going to bring my needle up where that French knot goes. So I have my first X and I'm ready to make my French knot. This is something that when you have a series of things like this, it's really a matter of finding your own kind of rhythm and which way those stitches work best for you. This is what I found was the most convenient for me and didn't waste as much thread. So I'm going to take the needle down for that French knot, and I'm just going to bring it up on the outside corner of the next X, so it will be ready to go. The last stitch that I would like to show you is the Lazy Daisy, and that stitch is what I used on these little tiny leaves going up and on either side of the rabbit. So the way to do a lazy daisy stitch, it's just like the beginning of a chain stitch. You're going to take the thread up at the base of the loop, put the needle back down in the same hole, come up at the tip of the loop, put your thread under the needle and pull it through. Now we're just going to tack it right on the other side of that loop to hold it in place. And that is a lazy daisy. I'll do one more. So the needle goes back in the same hole where the thread came out. It comes out at the tip of the little loop that's drawn. Thread goes under the needle and then tack it right on the other side of the loop. So I hope you enjoyed stitching this up, and I hope these answered a lot of your questions, and I can't wait to see what you do. If you stitch anything, please post it on Instagram, tag me, or on Facebook, and I can't wait to see what to stitch up and what threads you decide to choose. Thank you so much.